Welcome back to Mark Carney's book club. Today I'm going to wrap up chapter 7, which is on the global financial crisis. In the first two parts of this chapter, we talked about how the crisis came to be and the underlying mechanics of it, I guess you could say. He, at the time, was very involved in talking to the people in the Canadian government and with other governments and other banks to figure a way to weather the storm, essentially. This next little section is called Lessons in Crisis Management. Carney talks about how he learned 5 lessons in the following year after the crisis. So number 1 is that the market can be wrong longer than you can stay solvent. And the second lesson is that hope is not a strategy. You need to prepare for the worst case scenario. The third lesson he learned is to communicate clearly, frequently, and honestly. You can't spin your way out of a crisis. The fourth lesson he learned is just as there are no atheists in foxholes, there are no libertarians in financial crises. I knew that the US authorities now recognize the need for major action, but not wanting to give their game away, I concentrated on the strength of the Canadian banks. In this game of dominoes, the Canadian banks, who had kept their leverage down and steered clear of subprime lending, big securitizations, risky proprietary trading, and esoteric derivatives, would be the last to fall. I assured the callers that Canadian banks were the last stop before the barter economy. I left out my estimation that this was only weeks away. The fifth lesson he learned is the importance of overwhelming force. Fighting a financial fire with half measures is futile. And I can't help but think how relevant these lessons learned are in what he's dealing with right now with Trump down south. He says, I learned this most clearly in the weeks following the Lehman collapse. Canada was in the midst of a federal election, with the Conservative minority government of Prime Minister Stephen Harper seeking to return to power. With what in hindsight proved spectacularly poor timing, the campaign began a few days before the crisis erupted. The government was campaigning on the positive economic outlook. After Lehman fell, this was still true in relative terms. Canada would perform less badly than everyone else. But a future that was only really bad instead of outright awful wasn't so compelling. Election campaigns in Canada are relatively short, and the government didn't do much to adjust their message. At one point, they suggested that the free fall in the markets was a buying opportunity. To many voters, the stance was beginning to look like indifference. Along with the Bank of England governor, the chair of the Federal Reserve, and the president of the European Central Bank, they formed the view that central banks needed to conduct an unprecedented, coordinated 50 basis point interest rate cut to bridge the system through the weekend when there would be a G7 meeting and they might be able to act with overwhelming force to prevent free fall. But I was concerned. What if the Bank of Canada's actions laid bare that the government's position on the economy was untenable? Could the actions of an independent, apolitical central bank influence an election? But on reflection, I realized that not acting would be political. With the financial sector now imploding, we needed to provide immediate liquidity to the financial system. And with the global economy grinding to a halt, the Canadian economy would need major stimulus to preserve as many jobs as possible. Moreover, we needed to show markets that there was a pilot in the plane, that the authorities recognized the gravity of the situation and would act with overwhelming force. So that afternoon, the Bank of Canada Governing Council agreed to conduct an emergency interest rate cut first thing the next morning, alongside the Fed, ECB, Bank of England, Riksbank, and the Swiss National Bank. Around 7 p.m., I called the Finance Minister, Jim Flaherty, a brilliant, hard-nosed career politician who had appointed me as governor only a year before. After I had told him our plans, he asked whether the bank had ever done something like this before. Only after 9/11, I replied. There was a sharp intake of breath, and then after a long pause, good luck. The final section in this chapter on the financial crisis is building a new system from the ruins of the old. He talks about how he met with his fellow G7 ministers. They had a meeting that was full, frank, and focused, and the focus was on the only thing that mattered: saving what was left of the financial system to prevent a depression. Afterwards, as I walked down the steps of the US Treasury, I thought back to my first G7 meetings when, as finance deputy, I had the privilege of sitting next to the chair of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan. This was a time when the Washington consensus reigned supreme, the belief that free markets, free trade, floating exchange rates, and liberalized capital flows would promote global prosperity. The G20 was a young forum to socialize these pillars of globalization across the membership, and for a time it worked. Markets were liberalized and the global economy became increasingly integrated. Hundreds of millions of people rose out of poverty and global inequality began to fall. Greenspan understood far earlier than most how globalization and technology were driving a productivity boom in the US, and he correctly predicted that these forces would be disinflationary. There really was a new era, but new eras always bring risks alongside opportunities. At the same time, imbalances within and between economies began to grow. Inequality fell globally, but rose sharply in many advanced economies. The US became heavily dependent on foreign borrowing to fund its consumer spending and housing booms. The window to address these vulnerabilities was limited. By 2005, most indicators of financial stress were flashing amber, but few steps were taken. In his famous congressional testimony on the 23rd of October 2008, Greenspan issued a mea culpa. To those of us who have looked to the self-interest of lending institutions to protect shareholders' equity, myself especially, are in a state of shocked disbelief. He went on to state that he had been partially wrong to hold that some complex trading instruments such as credit default swaps did not need oversight. When the committee chair asked him, "You found your view of the world, your ideology was not right, it was not working," Greenspan replied, "Absolutely, precisely," before adding, "You know, that's precisely the reason I was shocked, because I have been going more than 40 years or more with very considerable evidence that it was working considerably well." As I headed into the hastily convened meeting of the G20, I knew that such light-touch, laissez-faire thinking was dead. With the economies in the emerging world sideswiped by the implosion of the financial systems in advanced economies, we would need to forge a new consensus. The G20 ministers convened to endorse the G7 decision that had been made to backstop the entire financial system with liquidity and capital if necessary. And so Chapter 8 is going to look into creating a simpler, safer, and fairer financial system, how that all worked out. Let me know your thoughts on Chapter 7. It was a doozy, and it definitely made me realize how smart he is and how he was looked at to be a leader in this time, and he was having lots of calls with lots of important people and helping navigate through the crisis. And I guess we'll see in Chapter 8 the part he played in the cleanup and what has happened since. Stay tuned for Chapter 8.